Thanks everybody for for coming to our session today on MFA, kind of the future of the capability. We've got for you a really stellar panel. Most of you know just by sight who these characters are. The usual suspects. We've got Mike Garcia from NIST and the Trusted Identities Group there. Ryan Fox from Capital One. Brenda Leong from the Future of Privacy Forum, and Ryan Anderson from the University of Texas Center for Identity. I'm Patrick Clancey, Senior Director for Federal Programs at MorphoTrust USA. Before we get into kind of the introductions, I'll let each of our panel members kind of introduce themselves and their respective organizations. But just a few comments, at the outset, just about the panel itself. So, what you see is kind of a cross section. We've got folks from the government, industry, the commercial sector, the private or nonprofit, as well as academic sector. So you're going to get really kind of a cross-functional view, a cross-cutting, opinion on capabilities. Not only MFA's use, its emergence, the reliance on it, but also some of the implications just in general from digital identity perspective. So as we seek, collectively, kind of greater reliability and lower risk to whatever use cases, business cases, commercial transactions, or security transactions we may seek to employ digital identities in support of, you'll kind of get that feel based on kind of the comments. So we've got kind of a discussion set up for you for the probably about 2/3 of our session here. And then we'll take some of your questions at the end, so we'll have time for that. If you would, just a reminder, the microphones are up in the front. This is being recorded, so if you do have a question, please come up to the microphone so it can be recorded for that answer. So without further ado, Mike, if you could introduce yourself and your role at NIST.
Sure, thank you. I'm Mike Garcia. I'm the lead of the Trusted Identities Group at NIST. I'm trying to figure out whether I can recycle my jokes from the panel last session, but the lights are so bright I have no idea if you're the same people or not. So I'm just going to do it, and I hope the laughs are bigger than they were last time. So our role in the Trusted Identities Group is to do what we can as government to foster a marketplace for stronger identity solutions, digital identity solutions. It's that simple of a seal. The idea for us is that I'll just use passwords as the everyman's foil of authentication. We know we don't like passwords, but it's not that I don't like passwords on their face, right? It's the fact that they're not always appropriate, and over time the quality of solutions in IT tend to degrade because the threats evolve, and so should our solutions. So a lot of folks dubbed us as the password killers when we opened our office a handful of years ago, and I never liked that a whole lot, because for me, it's not about killing the password. It's about making sure it never happens again. Not the password, but any individual solution. So the risk from a market perspective is that you get lock-in like we had with the password. The threats evolve, the solutions don't evolve, and whatever we end up 10 years from now is just as bad as the password, maybe worse. And we have a really hard time getting rid of it and replacing it again. So the real goal is to establish lower barriers to entry in a marketplace where solutions, when they succeed, they can flourish, they can gain a hold in the market, they can gain market share, and when they don't, they can gracefully find themselves exiting the market voluntarily or involuntarily. And ideally, if the incentives are good enough, then those organizations that are offering those solutions have the incentive to evolve at least as fast as the threats do. That's the ideal. So that's the vision statement. And our perspective is that no one provider can provide all the best solution. They can provide the best solution that will always be the best solution. And if they try to, then they don't really have the incentive to continue to evolve. And so from that perspective, then it really pushes towards leveraging commercial solutions rather than the government providing one.
Ryan Fox, Capital One.
My name is Ryan Fox. I work in our consumer identity department at Capital One. And so we're responsible for the onboarding, enrollment, verification, and authentication of all of our customers. So one of the things that's really interesting is I've kind of evolved into this role through my career is moving from the theory and the concepts of architectures and products to really the front lines of the practice. And so we really live on that front edge of needing to balance simplicity and security across our customer base. We're constantly responsible for managing the demands for different use case enablement, our compliance and regulatory requirements, and the simplicity and security to avoid abandonment and drop-off. So, as Mike was saying, avoiding this single solution kind of approach, we fully embrace that, where we have a completely layered defense system. And as we go through the panel today, I'll talk a little bit about kind of some of the passive things and the idea that there's always more going on below the surface than what you see with regards to authentication and security. Another thing that we're involved in right now that might be of interest to some of the people in the audience is our externalization of our services as well. One of the things we've realized as we've gone through the past, 50 years of our existence is to be good as a bank, you have to be good at identity. Identity has to be the foundation of what you do. And financial institutions have got really good at that over the years compared to many other segments of the market. And we think that it's foundational to our economy at large. And so I think Matt Thompson on our team announced yesterday that we're starting to roll some of those services out in beta to other organizations to be able to consume as well. So that's me. That's what we do.
Great. Brenda Leong, Future of Privacy Forum.
Good morning, and thanks for inviting us, Patrick, to participate in the panel today. Really appreciate that. So the Future Privacy Forum is a nonprofit located here in DC, and we are involved in seeking practical solutions in consumer and commercial privacy issues. So we're supported by a combination of grant and foundation funding and major tech companies, smaller tech companies, and work with both academics and our fellow advocacy groups, and then companies and industry to seek practical solutions for the way forward. So we work in all areas of digital privacy across industry. So we have a drones group, connected cars, smart cities, de-identification. These are all areas that we have focus groups or individuals who carry those areas in their portfolio. And I personally work in biometrics and artificial intelligence and seeking to have a little something called privacy by design incorporated into some of the planning and industry progress as we roll out new products and services for consumers, that people are thinking about the privacy implications of that in addition to the security implications. And obviously MFA is primarily a security plays a security role for access to those services, but also that is then a collection of whatever the data is that's being used for that access, and that has privacy implications as well. And so that is all part of what we're focused on and working to seek ways ahead that offer those products and services that consumers want, that are beneficial, that have so many valuable uses across society, but in a way that is respectful of individual rights and consumer need for transparency and control of their information, and an ability to make informed choices about how their data is collected and used.
Great, thanks. And last but not least, Ryan Anderson, University of Texas Center for Identity.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So the Center for Identity is a independent research center university-wide research center at the University of Texas. So we're not part of any particular discipline or school. We work with faculty researchers from across the university. And because the breadth and scope of UT research activities allows us to look at identity from what we call the ID 360 perspective, and that is taking into account all of the different implications and implementations and uses for identity, the impact on society, communications, technology. So our focus is certainly not exclusively based on technology, but again, looking at the societal impact of it. Privacy is a major component of our mission. And we try to focus on the public-private partnership at the university as well. So we have partners from the corporate sector and then from government and law enforcement as well, and see an integral part of our mission as bringing those two parties together. And as you've indicated, solutions from the private sector make their way into government, but they're not always accompanied with the willingness on the part of the citizen or the consumer to use government solutions. So we often say that private companies have what consumers want, and government has what consumers need. And frequently, people, based on their psychology, go after what they want more than what they need. So that whole public-private partnership of trying to identify solutions that can be implemented across the various sectors of society where identity is such a major player and is evolving defines and informs a lot of our research program. So I'll discuss a little bit some of the research that we're working on at the university as the discussion goes on. But the other point I wanted to mention is just I think that the idea of the calcification of frameworks is really important, and that's something we're trying to focus on. That when you have one solution that becomes adopted across the marketplace, and the threats leapfrog that solution, that brings its own problems. And a lot of our research programs are trying to identify new forms of authentication and verification that can be more durable and flexible, and at the same time less valuable to criminals. So.
So to kind of kick us off with a question just for the panel, as consumers become increasingly concerned about privacy and data protection, threats, Ryan, as you mentioned, the sophistication invariably, is going to, inevitably rise. So what are some of the efforts by your organizations to either influence or affect, the marketplace or consumer thoughts, behaviors, awareness, particularly with regard to multi-factor authentication? Mike?
Yeah, sure. So I can start.
Thanks, Mike.
Absolutely. So I'll talk a little more generally than multi-factor authentication first. So we at NIST have a privacy engineering program that we started a couple years ago. It kind of spun out of the Trusted Identities group, and it's all grown up. And it was very sad to move them out of our group, but it was a proud day that they moved out on their own and got their own apartment, et cetera. So we called it a privacy engineering program very intentionally. We believe that it is not so much that privacy is this special beast that you can't, wrap your arms around in the same way that you can, managing all sorts of other risk. It's that it's not a very developed field at this point. It's a young field. And IT in general is. I like to talk about aqueducts every once in a while and think about, how long we've been building bridges and aqueducts and things like that. Like, we've gotten pretty good at it because we've been doing it for like 5,000 years, right? We haven't been doing IT for 5,000 years. We sure haven't been doing digital privacy rights management of any sort for 5,000 years. And we haven't been doing multi-factor authentication for 5,000 years, it turns out, either. Although you could probably make an argument about that. It just wasn't digital. So in what we're trying to do with the privacy engineering is about risk management, and trying to do risk management the same way you do financial risk management, the same way that you do other IT security risk management. That it's about identifying identifying the bad things that can happen, identifying the likelihood of those bad things, and calculating risk scores, finding out which of the actions that you take with individuals' information creates the greatest risk, and then ordering those, prioritizing them, and finding ways to mitigate them. And so we have, this currently not particularly elegant set of Excel spreadsheets that one can use to walk through these data actions. And we're piloting it with federal agencies, with our pilots that we fund out of our office with our grants program. And it's, it can certainly be a painful process because people aren't used to thinking about it that way. But universally, by the end of it, something has changed in the way that a solution is being implemented that decreases the risk to individuals. And by doing so, decreases the risk and the liability to the organizations that are implementing those solutions. And so, that risk aspect, finding out what you're doing with your data action and what problems it can cause, it's a totally obvious fundamental thing, in the same way we've been doing security risk for a number of decades now.
Yeah. So along that point, Mike, because MorphoTrust went through that same privacy risk management process through our NSTIC funded grant. And this concept that Brenda brought up about privacy by design, those things are really kind of important for us foundationally, right, as we were developing our solution, so that it wasn't an afterthought, say when we were in testing or when we had rolled it out to a customer. Brenda, the idea of privacy by design, I know the forum plays a major role in kind of the thought leadership in this. What are some of the things, at least the conversations or the discussions around kind of these privacy concepts?
Well, I think it's the concept that privacy needs to be one of the development pillars right from the beginning of whatever the product or service is. So if there's a data collection involved in whether it's a gaming program for a student, or whether it's Alexa sitting on your counter, or whether it's the fingerprint access to your mobile phone, there's some sort of interaction with the consumer and some sort of collection of data. And so right from the beginning, it needs to be incorporated either starting with the framework of the FIPS, the Fair Information Practice Principles, that identify things like minimization, collecting only the data you need, using it only for what you've agreed to use it for, getting rid of it at some point in the future when that purpose is achieved. That needs to be part of the whole development and design process. And it doesn't need to be hard, and it doesn't need to be scary. And we are very big proponents of collaboration, and we're platform agnostic. It just needs to be something, whether it's NIST developing standards or other regulatory agencies, or whether it's industry standards that they develop together in a way that makes that safer and more easily accessible for consumers, and also more accessible for, as Mike was saying, new entrants into the market to be able to participate in that field. Those are all good things, and that can be complemented by ways to make those things proprietary by open source algorithms that are a standard for companies to use, but then can be tagged on with proprietary bits at the end that allow that particular company to control their access and their programs uniquely. Both creates more security and creates more business friendly environment for the companies involved. And that's the attitude that we would like to see behind all of the technology development. That's the world we live in now. That's the way we need to be thinking about and approaching how we interact on these platforms.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I would answer that question by maybe just asking a question of a group of identity and access management experts. How many of you guys use like a crypto key to protect your private email services? I'm intentionally avoiding standards and brand names. So let's call that sub 10%. Yeah. So like people who know the value of multi-factor authentication, they know the risk that you're at every day. And there's like a bar up here that you could opt into. You could go buy a key for a very affordable amount and increase the level of security, protecting your own personal data. You could take that action today and tonight, but you didn't. You haven't because it's hard. And so take that same mentality, translate that to the average consumer base, multiply it by a large number, and imagine the behavioral patterns. So, consumers will always choose the path of least resistance is the point that I'm making. And if you're in a position where you're relying on your customers to make interest in their best decisions when it comes to, or in their best interest when it comes to security, that's probably not going to happen. Sans 9% of the time there, right? So, one of the things that we've done and the approach that we've taken is kind of maybe twofold. One is always put in place passive mechanisms for protecting the customer. When you go to a financial institution and you engage, the security mechanisms that you're looking at represent really the tip of the iceberg. Whether or not you're being engaged with a one-time password or you're putting in a username and password, whatever the case may be, that is really just a small fraction of what's taking place below the surface. I would argue that we're always two-step or multi-factor authenticating our customers by the nature of understanding where are they, what's their behavioral pattern, what kind of device are they on, have we seen this person before, on and on and on and on. So it's always dynamic, it's always risk-based, and it's always multi-layered. The other thing is make sure that it's contextual, right? So, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago, we launched a product called Swift ID, which leveraged a lot of the kind of push authentication capabilities on smartphones. And so instead of our customers kind of being like surprised, like what's this text message or what's going on, we could deliver an authentication job to the device. And when we did that, we could deliver context to say, this is what you're trying to do. This is why this is happening. This is what this is about. We need you to take the following action. And so instead of requiring them to kind of go and enroll or adopt a procedure that they didn't understand the value of, it was authentication, it was security that found them in the moment and in the context of a specific transaction that made sense. And so in doing that, you can actually drive some better behavior. So those are just a couple of things that I think we think about when we think about MFA and driving use.
Yeah. So I think safe to say that the tipping point for knowledge-based authentication versus MFA, we're still a way off. Just consumer demand.
The tipping point for MFA versus knowledge base?
Yeah. So, I mean, just I guess a preference in the marketplace or consumer demand for, just representative of kind of.
I don't think a consumer thinks about it that way. I think they think about what's easiest,
Mhm.
right? I mean, that's why Touch ID had such adoption, right? It was, you went away from a knowledge-based login with a pen to something I could just touch, and it was adopted not because it was a pattern that they understood, but because it took half the time.
Right.
And so it's really that simple, and that kind of ring the bell linear.
Yeah.
As far as is it easier? Do I have a cognitive load associated with doing this? No, then I'll do it.
Right. So the onus really on industry, right? To advance.
That's right.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Just to paint a little bit of a more granular picture,
That sounded offensive.
I
You're attacking me there, Mike.
it was him I was attacking,
Oh.
actually. Yeah, no, you were fine.
Okay.
In that case, it's all right.
Yeah, you can always attack the moderator.
Carry on.
Yeah. Free game.
Yeah. So they're just up there as a foil. It's just the straw man. I like to think back to when the U.S. government released the National Strategy for Trust Identities in Cyberspace, the NSTIC, as it's lovingly called, which is just over 6 years ago, and it was released 2 months after Google Authenticator was released. So 6 years ago, there were so few multi-factor authentication solutions that Google released Google Authenticator, and at that time, it was basically just used by Google employees that were told they had to, right? Now, I can't there's like a 90% chance that when I walk out of this room, back to the expo, I'm going to trip on someone's multi-factor authenticator, right? I mean, they're everywhere. There's a massive variety of them. I probably have 4 or 5 different apps on my phone for multi-factor authentication, in addition to, to text messages, which is probably the most prevalent at this point. We'll table the discussion on whether or not that makes sense. And we're coming up with newer and more innovative ways to do it. I'm starting to wonder whether the term multi-factor authentication is even an appropriate one, because I can't convince myself whether continuous authentication in a passive form is multi-factor, or it's just a different thing that we haven't come up with a term for under a different umbrella yet, right? The world's incredibly different than it was. If you look at an enterprise level in use of multi-factor authentication from 6 years ago, the numbers have about tripled probably. I haven't seen a recent stat. I should go find one so that I sound smarter next time I say that. But it was something like in the low 20s of organizations that said that anyone in their organization was using multi-factor authentication 5 years ago, and it's probably in the 60s or 70s right now. We've seen huge movement, at least on privileged user access and multi-factor authentication, and then we've seen things that start to stimulate a change in the mindset of individuals as well. There are websites out there that you click on a button, twofactorauth.org. You click on a button and you can tweet about how your bank should have two-factor authentication and they don't, and you're mad about it, right? And it lists every provider in a whole bunch of different industries, hundreds and hundreds of them, and whether they offer multi-factor authentication and of what form. So things really have changed. And, this is technology and this is an S-shaped adoption curve, right? And we're climbing that steep part right now. And we should be pretty optimistic, but know that that's the part where you have to push really hard or you fall into the pit and to never come out, as many technologies have done before. So, there are a lot of good signs, especially on the authentication front, but we have to continue making them easier, continue making them, the obvious choice for a user, like fingerprint sensing on smartphones has become, and just keep pushing along, because, really the industry's done an incredible job over the past handful of years.
Yeah, I think that
multi-factor authentication is a really good way to crystallize the whole conversation because it throws the privacy, convenience, security conundrum into relief for people. Privacy is an abstraction, I think, for most people when they're transacting. It's important, and we've done some studies on different demographics' attitude towards privacy, but we also have some studies about identity literacy, and they don't always match up. People don't know what they're talking about or what we're talking about a lot of times when we're talking about identity and privacy and multi-factor authentication. Just at UT, we rolled out multi-factor authentication in 2014 with an Austin-based company, and it was a unmitigated disaster. There's about 80,000 people at UT between staff, faculty, and students. So wide demographic. I mean, it would make for a fantastic case study, actually, because the drag on the organization, on the IT groups, nobody anticipated that people would not use it because it wasn't convenient enough. Not only was it not convenient enough, it wasn't clear enough how to use it. And so one or two obstacles to adoption is all it takes for consumers, to dump something into that pit of technology. So we are constantly pressing for in the context of this risk versus security conversation, which is the sort of framework through or the lens through which we have a lot of our conversations internally and we drive a lot of our research programs. Privacy is always flittering around the periphery. It's certainly important, and we're always pushing for privacy to have a seat at the table of development of technology. But it's almost like privacy convenience need to go hand in hand at the development stage. That the privacy and the security can only be as good as the convenience factor. So I think that, again, multi-factor authentication is a great case study for looking at how people adopt these technologies and people's reaction, and then how the marketplace can respond to them. So I think, Ryan, that the fact that you guys have, like you said, continuous multi-factor authentication going on that the consumer's not even aware of, I think that's the road forward in a lot of ways, for at least for transactional purposes.
And so, Ryan, you mentioned kind of the externalization of some of your services. Matt mentioned yesterday with your digital identity developer API.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you can kind of share on that capability itself?
Yeah, so we have recently launched 3 products. There's a sign up, verify, and sign in capabilities. So, as I mentioned, as much as it's critical that we expose those capabilities to our customers as they interact with our products online, we think that there's an opportunity for us to kind of help the economy and society at large by offering some of those same capabilities, whether it's the passive capabilities, whether it's the identity verification capabilities, or the strong auth capabilities, out for other developers and other organizations to be able to leverage those and afford that same kind of balance of simplicity and security into their apps, into their user experiences. So we've launched that in beta, trying to kind of test out how the market feels about that. And so it's on our developer portal, and kind of seeing where we can go with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Brenda, I know you guys just wrapped on your recent tech lab, and you guys have a booth downstairs in the atrium as well. Any themes or particularly relevant feedback that you received, through those events?
Yeah, so we for 2 years in a row now have done a hands-on tech lab where we buy a bunch of the fun products and toys and things that companies have come out with that are all internet connected. Apparently, after listening to the keynote this morning, I'm going to be on the lookout for underwear for next year. That'll be exciting. But we put them all on display, hook them all up, do an analysis, put up a little sign about what their privacy and security access is, and then we open it up and let people come in. And it's designed, to pull in legislators, to pull in the data protection authorities from Europe. We time it while they're in town for a conference, and then just anybody that we target to come in. And it's always a little eye-opening to see people actually play with and use some of the devices, whether it's the Snapchat glasses or a virtual reality program, or just walk by a screen and see the facial recognition pop up that they are female and smiling and give an age estimation or whatever it's designed to do, whatever level of detection it's designed for. And it's just that we read and we talk about, we see a lot of these things, and we all have our smartphones, we all have certain aspects of this, but there's so many things out there that we read about and hear about, but it's a lot different to actually put your hands on them and try them out. So we do have some of them down in our booth here. There's a mirror that's a little scary. Obviously, one of the key things in any biometric access needs to be aliveness. awareness liveness test. It's just sort of basic for anti-spoofing technologies. And the mirror, you can literally print out a picture, stick it on a stick, and hold it up and get the mirror to learn that face as one of its users and create a data file for it. And if it's the picture of a real person that you have both the picture and the person, which we did for one of the people in our office, it will take either one. Like, it makes no distinction between them. So, not a great reference for that particular product. We also have done pretty extensive studies on children's toys in this regard and how they connect to the internet. And again, although I don't mean to sound as if we're all falling into the pit today, because generally we tend to be very optimistic about the opportunities and uses that these products offer. I do, again, have to flip back to this morning's keynote about putting a chip in everything just because we can and then waiting to see whether bad things happen or not. That's certainly a little bit concerning in children's toys, because there are things that are collecting data either directly from children or in the environment where children are, and not a lot of forethought necessarily given to what's being done with that data and how it's being stored and how it's being used and who might have access to it, and what if the child makes statements that might indicate that there's harm being caused or some other unsafe condition that the child is in. What is the responsibility of the company? Should they have to respond? There's just a lot of second and third order effects that are not always thought about carefully in advance for those kinds of things. So happy to talk about any of those later in detail, or please stop by later and check them out.
Great, thanks. And Ryan, any research topics that would be especially relevant to the audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a cornerstone research program called the Identity Ecosystem that classifies it. It's like nodes. The way it's visualized is nodes with connector lines, and the nodes are all different types of PII. I think we've got 150 types of PII in there, and we look at the relationship between all of those. Sometimes it's a breeder relationship, sometimes it's a dependency relationship, and then are using that with a couple of different objectives. One is, for industry's sake, trying to come up with a valuation of different PII assets, and to a certain extent, that's a game, because they're sort of arbitrary valuations. But at the same time, we know we work with a lot of insurance companies that are struggling with that for cybersecurity policies. How much is your social security number worth? And right now, we know what it's transacted for on the black market, but we don't know what its intrinsic value is to an individual, to an organization. And then can you flip that and say, okay, if the asset value is X for a particular piece of PII, what is the liability value of that same unit of information, so that organizations and individuals can have a more informed approach to it. But the other thing we're doing with the ecosystem is looking at what are authentication factors that can leapfrog the vulnerabilities. So we classify everything along the 4 domains of what you have, what you know, who you are, and then what you do. And I think the area of opportunity around, I don't know if it's a phrase yet, behavior metrics as opposed to biometrics. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and that identity ecosystem program is showing us how we can use behavioral metrics to authenticate identities in a way, once again, that's durable and that offers a high level of assurance, but that isn't particularly valuable to bad guys. And like with respect, there's privacy implications. I mean, with you're talking about children's toys and the data that's gathering. There's behavioral recognition or behavioral authentication data that's being gathered inadvertently. Just by the patterns of whether it's keystroke recognition or gait recognition or any of these things that companies may be gathering that then a third party could take that data and connect the dots. So that project is giving us some new insights about all of those relationships.
Excellent. Great. So we've got a little under 10 minutes. We could take some questions if you guys are game for that. So we'll open it up to the audience for any questions, and I'd ask that you just come down to the microphone here. So that we get you recorded.
I guess I'll ask about the elephant in the room. What is the most secure metric right now, or technology for 2FA in light of the SMS breakdown of late?
Secure.
Everybody looks at the NIST guys.
actually, can I say something? I'll tee you up, I think, based on our conversation last week.
Yeah.
So I would like to dispel the myth that there's a most secure anything that applies to everything. I think that whole, without meaning to be direct about that, I think that whole way of framing it needs to maybe be rethought, because everything is a basis of risk and context. And what is it you're securing? What's the value of it to you as a consumer, to whoever else you're having your transaction with? And what is the threat model that you're under in that particular instance? And I'm just going to give a quick example, and then I'm going to kick it to Mike, because we talked about this, and I think he has some good thoughts on this as well. But the sort of typical mocking of somebody who doesn't really understand security is that they write a password on their sticky note, stick it on their computer. And in fact, that may not be the worst level of security that you have, because if you have a really long involved password that you actually can't remember, it's a better password. And if the only threat is to somebody who can physically walk into your office and see it sticking on your monitor, and you're not carrying it around, and you're not dropping it out in the parking lot, you're not doing other things with it, then that's actually probably not the worst security that you could have, given the environment, the risk, and the context of what you're protecting and what you're doing. Please don't take that away as a tweet that I'm recommending that everybody write down their passwords on sticky notes and leave them lying about. But it's just an example that there are no absolutes. There's no perfect security. Any security used is better than no security for the most part. And less strong security that's easy for the consumer to get to, as has been pointed out, and that they are therefore motivated to use, is going to be better and lower their risk than something that's too difficult to the extent where they just don't use it at all and put themselves at greater vulnerability.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think it's really important to maintain an identity, a really strong Goldilocks Syndrome. So it's not about the best, it's about the right. And in some cases, multi-factor authentication might not be the right, because, you want to get, you need to get to, you want access to this, or users want access to something quickly, and it's not of high risk. So don't protect it that well. You don't have to, unless, but if it turns out there's a really easy way to protect it that's convenient for the user as well, great, give it a higher level of authentication. There's nothing wrong with that, but don't overdo it. Because that is what dissuades users in a lot of cases. And, and then if there's a lot of value behind whatever it is you're protecting, protect it well. And that's, it's about that risk basis. And it's about making those decisions that are best for any given context. And then, I certainly won't answer the question about what is best. As a government person, I can't endorse anything in particular. And even more generically than that, just thinking about technologies, it's hard to say. And it really does depend where you're trying to apply it and how you're applying it, and whether a user can find a way around it and take an easier path in that. And that's that user experience part of it, what the user's actually going to practically do, is incredibly important. I feel like we talked about something, I'm forgetting it. What was it?
No, we hit the
Did I get
privacy
it?
engineering stuff. Yeah, we talked about, yeah.
All right,
I
great.
think we're good.
That's
I
terrific.
think we're good. Unless you want to talk about 863.
I'm happy to do that.
Well, let's, after this gentleman's got
So I'm going to put Ryan on the spot here. So you said you want to share those identity APIs with other organizations. Those organizations include competing banks, community banks, federal credit unions.
Yeah, I think we're open to seeing what evolves there. The spirit of having an open developer platform is that, you're kind of saying, hey, there's people out there that have good ideas other than me, and we want to see what comes of that. So is there one specific group or individual that we're saying yes or no to? No. We're taking those as they come, and we want to see how it takes shape. And that's the spirit of open development.
What a great segue to talk about 863.
Great.
What's not?
You got 3 minutes.
When you're a hammer trying to finalize 863. So the biggest publication that we put out of our office is NIST Special Publication 863, which has now been renamed to Digital Identity Guidance. And this, the instead of talking about the document itself, which I like to think is substantially improved from the previous version, it's evolved greatly as our solution set has, and the threat vectors. What I talk about is that open development piece of it. So for the first time of any major project, NIST hosted that document on GitHub, which is an open platform for developers, to actually, what I like to think of as evolve from this normal thing NIST does, and we're pretty good at, of involving stakeholders and co-editing the documents. We go in a room, we write it, we try to do our best, we meet with stakeholders, we learn as much as we can, put it out, get public comments, take those comments, go back in the room, work on it again, try to understand all the comments, talk to some stakeholders if we didn't understand what their comment was, put something back out. Usually, the time to know whether your comment was included and how it was included used to be something like 4 to 6 months, and we've gotten it down to about a day. So that, from the perspective of engaging other people, is a massive improvement, obviously in the timeline, but also in the quality of the engagement, because people then can come back and we directly comment on, and respond to their comment and say, here's the change we made. Does it make sense? And sometimes we get it wrong. Quite often we get it wrong, and they say, that's not really what I meant, this is what I meant, right? And it's incredibly useful. So I like to think that as moving from that co-editing that we used to do to co-development and really writing with industry and with agencies. And the value of that, of course, it sounds very lovely, and it helps me do slightly less work because I can convince industry people to write sentences instead of our team. But the real value there is that it gives us the opportunity to include things in a way that we might not be able to directly include because industry partners aren't willing to share certain things, right? It's a very elusive sentence. But the idea that, that MorphoTrust or Cap One is building something that they haven't talked about yet, but they want to make sure it fits in the standard, might influence the way they want the standard to be written. And so when they can directly comment on that, and they say, well, okay, that makes sense, and it seems more flexible. I have no idea what they're actually thinking or what they're trying to do, and I don't care. I don't need to. I want it to be the most flexible possible standard. It gives us a better opportunity to do that. And so in some sense, we can more effectively future-proof that document and leave room for evolution, because we know that we're not going to update it in the next couple of years, and that the world's going to change in the next couple of years, and we're not going to update it in the next couple of years because I can't go through it again. And that's just the reality of how these guidelines work. So the real question is, how flexible can we make it while still doing what we need to mitigate risk?
So we're between you guys and lunch, and I think we'll wrap here. Thank you very much to our panelists for their commentary today, the discussions and the questions. Thank you.